Well, good morning, church. If you are new with us this morning, my name is Ike. I'm one of the pastors here, and would love an opportunity to meet you if you're new with us. So be sure to stop in the lobby and say hello. I'd love to get to know you and hear more about you. This morning, I kind of wanted to teach on a stool. Main reason being, I feel like the conversation we're going to have this morning is a conversation that I have a lot in my office. I have a lot sitting across, chair beside chair to people, and just an intimate conversation. And so felt like let's create that kind of environment here this morning. And so I've got my coffee, you've got your coffee, we're both in our chairs, and want to dive into this. One of the popular shows on HGTV is the show Good Bones. Has anybody seen it, know of it? Not that popular, apparently. The idea for this show is that they track down these old homes that have fallen into disrepair. And rather than tearing them down, they strip them to the bones, and then they restore the house. The idea is that the bones, the structures of the house are good, that the layout of the house is good. We just need to restore it. We need to dress it up. We need to fix it. And so it's kind of, I think, a part of the reason for those that are interested in the show, the reason it is popular for them, is because of the transformation that this house undergoes. To see the house experience this transformation from dilapidated to brand new and beautiful. It's kind of like when people say, we bought this house, we stripped it to the studs, and we built it back, but it's 100 years old, but we restored it because it had good bones. And you hear that and you go, oh, wow. And we say that because there's a story to this house. There's history to this house. You don't necessarily say that maybe when there's a new build of a house. You're like, it may be beautiful, but there's not a story there. There's not a history to it. But in order for them to do this work, there's kind of at least three ingredients, or three parts of this that have to happen in order for there to be this transformation. The first is that you have to have a vision for the restoration. You have to be able to see what it could look like on the other side of the restoration, after you've torn down all of the parts that are broken and rebuilt it. You have to have confidence in the integrity of the structure, or that it can be repaired. You have to have trust in the integrity of the structure. And then lastly, you have to be able to see its positive aspects despite its flaws. This morning, as we come to the end of our 4-week series on marriage, we're wrapping up by talking about restoring our marriages. What does it look like to restore our marriage? How do we take some initial steps in that? And much like the restoration of these homes, I want to talk about at least 3 ingredients, and there's more than this, but 3 ingredients or 3 parts of restoring our marriages. And I want to be clear that this is not just true for marriages. This is true for all kinds of relationships. Maybe you're here this morning and you're single. This is true for dating relationships. This is true for coworker relationships. This is for friendships. These components are important for all relationships. But the first piece is for a relationship, is there vision? Do you have a vision for what this relationship looks like when it's restored? Is there trust? And then affection and admiration. What I mean by vision, vision is a preferred future. Andy Stanley says vision is a clear mental picture of what could be. And so as you think about your marriage, if our marriage could look like anything, without the constraints of what I think is possible, or without the constraints of what I know how to do, what would it look like? What could it look like? The ingredient of trust. Do you trust them? And if not, how do you rebuild it? How do we go about rebuilding trust? And then lastly, affection and admiration. I may not be as familiar with that term in terms of this context of affection and admiration, but it's kind of the idea of like, not just do you love them, but do you like them? Can you see their positive traits, not just their flaws? We started this morning by reading this passage from Nehemiah. And the reason I wanted to go to Nehemiah is the cupbearer for the king in Persia, but he gets this vision to go and to restore the walls around Jerusalem. And so he goes, and what we see in this passage that we read this morning was him checking out, observing the walls. What kind of condition are they in? And he's walking around them, and he sees that the walls are broken down, the gates are burned, and it would have been easy for him, maybe even natural, to look around and conclude there's no hope here. What's the use? What's the point? I wonder if there are some couples here this morning who look at their marriage, and it feels like the walls are crumbling, and it feels like everything's on fire, and you wonder, what's the use? What hope is there for your relationship? What drives Nehemiah in this story was not the probability of things getting better based on current circumstances. What drives Nehemiah is the possibility of a better future if they could latch on to this vision of their future. I want to ask you this morning, what could a vision of a better future for your marriage look like? Don't start with how likely is it to happen or what needs to change in order for it to happen, but with what could it look like if this relationship was healed and repaired? What would it feel like? What emotions do you imagine yourself having, maybe for the first time in a long time? What would the story of your relationship be? Would it be this powerful story of redemption and healing, of rising from the ashes of brokenness to the experience of restoration? Letting that be the first thought, and then letting that be what inspires you to figure out, how do we do this? To give you a little more context on Nehemiah, and the history behind this, 586 BC, Babylon and the kingdom of Babylon come and destroy Jerusalem. King Nebuchadnezzar, maybe you're familiar with that name, they come in, they destroy Jerusalem, and then they take the Israelites into exile in Babylon. Well, 539 BC, Cyrus, the king of Persia, overthrows the Babylonian king and takes control over those regions, including Jerusalem. And then 538, Cyrus issues a decree that Jewish exiles can return to their ancestral home. They can return back to Jerusalem. 516 BC, the temple is rebuilt. But then we come almost 100 years later, 445 BC. That's where we pick up with Nehemiah. And many people have moved back to Jerusalem at this point, and they've rebuilt the temple, but they have not rebuilt the walls. They have not fortified the city. And so this city of God is still vulnerable because it lacks these structures to protect it. And so I want to talk about this story as a way of getting into what I think are three obstacles for us when it comes to having a vision for our marriage. The first thing you need to know is that a vision for your marriage is not based on current conditions. You don't develop a vision for your marriage based on current conditions. Nehemiah 2, it says, I went out at night through the valley gate toward the serpent's well and the dung gate. It's just like, how do you come up with that name? It's like not a gate you want to go to very often. And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. I went on to the fountain gate in the king's pool, but further down it became too narrow for my animal to go through. So I went up at night by way of the valley and inspected the wall. Then heading back, I entered through the valley gate and returned. So it's given us this idea of Nehemiah's trip around the city inspecting the gate, and it includes this interesting detail at one point where it becomes too narrow for his animal to go through. And one of the reasonings around the inability for this animal to go through is because of the amount of destruction and rubble from this wall crumbling. There was so much that his animal could not even go through this part of the city. And so when we look at the conditions that Nehemiah was up against here, it wasn't even like he was starting from scratch, like a flat surface. He was going to have to first deal with the rubble, the destruction, the debris of the wall that had been broken down. Him having a vision for the rebuilding of these walls was not based on the fact that this was going to be easy to do. In fact, it was going to be extremely difficult. And so a vision for the healing and repair of your marriage is not determined by the current conditions of your marriage. It's not just because it's going to be really hard, or maybe it's just going to be really easy, so let's have a vision for it. This leads to the second thing that vision is not. A vision for your marriage is not based on how probable it is. Oftentimes when you think about creating vision and your criteria is how probable is it, most likely that vision is going to be very small. Nehemiah 2:16, it says, "The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, for I had not yet told the Jews, priests, nobles, officials, or the rest of those who would be doing the work." It seems Nehemiah might have been a little hesitant to tell everybody, here's what I'm envisioning, because they might think he was a little bit delusional. There was a reason that the people had returned for almost 100 years and still not rebuilt the walls. This was going to be difficult, if not seemingly impossible. And then lastly, the third thing, a vision for your marriage is not based on your current knowledge of how to do something. Verse 17, "So I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned. Come, let's rebuild Jerusalem's walls so that we will no longer be a disgrace." Nehemiah calls to them to do this work not because they knew how to do this work. I mean, we're talking about priests and nobles and officials. Nehemiah was a cupbearer, for goodness sake. He didn't know about building walls. His reason for doing this wasn't because he knew how, it's because of the trouble that they were in. Healing our marriages is not done because we already know how to do it, but because of the seriousness of the trouble we find ourselves in. That this work needs to be done. It needs to be done because we want a different future for this relationship. And a vision of how a rebuilt relationship might look inspires us to figure out how to rebuild the relationship. I want to say for a second, if you're here this morning and maybe you don't find your relationship in crisis, I still want to challenge you to think about what a vision for your marriage could look like. A vision for your marriage that's bigger than just, do we make each other happy? I believe that a part of God bringing us together as a couple is for us to be on mission together in an intentional way. And one of the ways that the evil one undermines that is by creating tension between us, to distract us from the powerhouse that he has put together, that God has put together in you as a couple to be on mission for him. So the second ingredient that I wanted to get into was trust. And in particular, I want to talk about how do you rebuild trust. One way to think about rebuilding trust or how trust is gained through consistent, believable action over time. Trust is gained through consistent, believable action over time. Meaning, when you don't have someone's trust, the way that you build that is that they see you consistently being the same person over a period of time. Consistently doing the honorable thing, the thing of integrity. And not only that, but that when you tell them what you've been up to, it's believable, right? It's not inconsistent with what they've been telling you about who they are. In the first message of this series, Sharon alluded to a challenging season in our marriage. And I want to encourage you, if you missed the first week of the series, to go back and listen to that. But in that season, a part of what made that challenging was that I had lost some of her trust. As I mentioned at the beginning of this is a conversation that I have a lot in my office. I do a lot of counseling. I believe it's one of the most important things I do as a pastor is counseling, and especially with a lot of couples. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in communication, especially when trust has been lost, is that communication is a consistent pain point. When there's been maybe an infidelity of some sort, or maybe there's a struggle with pornography or a struggle with addiction, anything where trust has been broken, one of the things that makes communication difficult is in those moments, your pain points clash. Each of your needs conflict with the other. What I mean by that is the one whose trust has been lost asks a lot of questions in search of reassurance. They're asking questions in search of Is your behavior consistent? Can I trust your behavior? And they're in search of reassurance. But on the other hand, for the one who has lost the other's trust, those questions feel like accusations. Those questions feel like an attack on our pride, our honor. It leaves us asking, have we not made any progress? And so we end up at this place where the pain that each of us are experiencing is becoming an obstacle to the rebuilding of the trust. And so I want to speak to both parties this morning. I first want to speak to those who have caused the loss of trust, or maybe who have broken trust. For those of us who have broken trust, the first thing is we have to accept that if we've broken the trust, we must be willing to bear the majority of the weight to rebuild it. One of the ways that I think about rebuilding trust and the process to do that is to create as many avenues as possible for your partner to intersect with your consistent behavior. What I mean by that is, a lot of times when trust has been broken, is coming up with what are going to be the safety mechanisms or the habits or the things that we're going to do to make sure whatever it is doesn't continue or doesn't happen again. It can be things like making sure that they can see all purchases on all of your accounts. Things like being willing to let them see text messages and call logs whenever they ask without question. It can be things like being willing to set up filters and blockers on devices. It can be willing to submit to a drug test whenever as needed. And some of these things at times may seem excessive, but the point of it is the more avenues that they can go down to intersect with your consistent behavior, the faster that trust will be rebuilt. But I want to be clear here, and I don't want you to miss the forest for the trees. What I mean by that is, behind all of this is the question of, is your highest priority rebuilding the trust? What I mean by that is, the less we resist these requests of a spouse, of a partner, of a friend, the more it demonstrates on the whole that our highest priority is rebuilding their trust. A part of my journey with Sharon was I chose to banish the words, "Why can't you just trust me?" from my vocabulary. Not only because it becomes an easy out for me, but it also casts shame on her for not rebuilding her trust faster. The second thing I would say for those of us who have broken trust is to understand that we cannot dictate the timeline. We can't dictate the timeline for how fast trust must be rebuilt. On the other side, for the one whose trust has been broken, there are some things that you can do as well. That this is a two-way street, that this involves both of us. And these are two hard things. But the first thing, and I need to explain what I mean by this, but the first thing is to stop trying to control their behavior. It's not that they are trying, not that you're trying to control them, but it's the mindset, the mentality that if you just do enough of the right things, you can make them trustworthy again. That if I just implement enough of the right things, enough of the right guardrails, if I just am the right kind of spouse to them, then I will make them trustworthy again. And what that ultimately does is it heightens our own anxiety around their behavior. But the second thing that you can do, and this is also really hard, is to risk trust. What I mean by that, inherent in the concept of trust is the belief that they will do the right thing even when I'm not looking. It's a risk. But until we give them the opportunity to demonstrate that they are trustworthy, they're never going to have the opportunity to prove that. But more importantly, trust is a muscle. And we only build it by exercising it. And so that muscle of trust cannot begin to grow if we are never not watching, if we don't give them opportunities to demonstrate their trustworthiness. Now, I want to be clear here. If you've risked trust repeatedly and it's been repeatedly broken. I'm not saying you just need to do this forever. There's a point at which there's a place for healthy boundaries. But if you haven't taken that step of risking trust, I want to encourage you to take that step, and it doesn't have to be big. This can start tiny little steps of trust to begin to rebuild. The second thing that I mentioned, or the third thing, I guess, as an ingredient of restoring our marriages and restoring relationships is rebuilding affection and admiration for our spouse or our partner. Another way of saying this is earlier this year, Sharon and I were teaching at a marriage conference, and during the question and answer, one of the questions that we got was, what do I do if I have fallen out of love with my spouse? Falling in love with someone can be a bit abstract. What does that mean to have fallen in love, fallen out of love? But I think something that is more tangible is, have we forgotten what we like about them? What drew us to them in the first place? What made us want to spend the rest of our lives with them in the first place? To recover some of the positive ways of seeing our spouse that over the years maybe we have lost sight of. One of the books that we've recommended a lot in this is John Gottman's book, 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. And I want to encourage you, if you don't have that book, I want to encourage you to pick it up, 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. But he says in there, in his section on rebuilding, and he talks about fondness and admiration, he says, by simply reminding yourself of the spouse's positive qualities, even as you grapple with each other's flaws, you can prevent a happy marriage from deteriorating. The simple reason is that fondness and admiration are antidotes for contempt. Contempt is one of the most corrosive, if not threatening, aspects that comes against our marriages. And so I want to give you a couple of really practical tools this morning for rebuilding affection and admiration. The first of these is to remember your history. Can you remember what it felt like when you first fell in love? Can you remember what it felt like when you first met, or what it was like when you first got married, before there were kids to keep alive or a mortgage to pay? This is still that person. They're still in there. Can you get in touch with that affection for this person, even if it's just an inkling of it? What was it about them that caught your eye? What did her attention make you feel? How was the wedding day? How was the honeymoon? Can you recall any funny moments in your relationship? Funny stories in your relationship? What are some romantic moments in the relationship? What was that suave thing that he did on your third date that you'll never forget? Gottman says 94% of the time, couples who put a positive spin on their marriage's history and their partner's character are likely to have a happy future as well. When happy memories are distorted, it's a sign that the marriage needs help. I want to ask you this morning, have your marriage memories become distorted? Maybe a more crass way of saying this, but hopefully it'll help you remember it. Maybe we've painted some things with the poop brush that were actually pretty great. The second thing that I want to recommend for you, and this is a tool that's in Gottman's book, is a 7-week course on fondness and admiration. A 7-week course on fondness and admiration. What this is it's 7 weeks with 5 tasks a week. And it's basically each day there's a thought and a task. For example, the thought might be, I am genuinely fond of my partner. And the task is, list one characteristic you find endearing or lovable. Another thought would be, another day, I can easily speak of the good times in our marriage. The task is, pick one good time and write a sentence about it. Another thought might be, I am physically attracted to my partner. And the task would be to think of one physical attribute you like. It's a small exercise, but it's about rewiring our brains in how we think about our spouse. And this may feel forced at first, it may feel awkward, but it doesn't mean it's fake. It doesn't mean it's wrong. Anytime we do something for the first time, a lot of times it's awkward. It is weird. But we've so formed pathways about our spouse that we can't think outside of that box that we've put them in. And so sometimes couples will feel like this searching for their spouse's positive traits or expressing gratitude for their positive behaviors feels phony. But to draw on Gottman one more time, he says that developing a positive habit doesn't sugarcoat a relationship. Instead, it resets it to a more realistic perspective. Let me tell you what I mean. There was research done by Elizabeth Robinson and Gail Price, and what they did was that they trained these observers, these objective observers, to count how many positive acts they witnessed between a couple during the course of an evening. So they're watching this couple for positive acts and keeping account of them. Then they asked the spouses themselves to tally the number of positive interactions they recall from that evening together. And then they compared their own scores with what the observers had counted. And what they discovered is that couples who described themselves as unhappily married only noticed half of the positive interactions that actually occurred. And Gottman says, because they were so used to tuning into their partner's mistakes, they missed a full 50% of their partner's positive actions. Does this ring true for you this morning? Does it ring true that we've become so focused on our partner's mistakes and failures and flaws that we cannot see the positive actions and behaviors and traits? To pull all of this together, when we have a vision for a better future of our marriages, or maybe another relationship that needs restoring, we can do the hard work to rebuild trust, and we can do the awkward work to rebuild affection and admiration. To bring us back to Nehemiah, at the close of this story, he says, I told them how the gracious hand of my God had been on me, and what the king had said to me. They said, let's start rebuilding. And their hands were strengthened to do this good work. Church, let's start rebuilding our marriages. Wherever you find yourself this morning, whatever insurmountable work feels needs to be done, I want you to know that the gracious hand of God can be on you. It can strengthen you for this good work if you will ask Him. And so I want to just create some space right now for us to go to God and to ask for His hand to be on us, to strengthen us for this good work, for us to go and start rebuilding. We're going to have our prayer team available if you would like to come forward and have somebody pray with you, or maybe you want to turn to your spouse, partner, and just begin to ask, what does it look like for us to have a better vision for our marriage? But let's just take some time now and bow our heads and pray as we head into the rest of our service.